Stockfish 12 has won the TCEC Supercomputer Tournament. Now, this is a watershed moment in computer chess. It definitively shows that this new approach that Stockfish 12 uses, that includes brute force computing, looking at millions of positions per second, and neural networks, that deep positional understanding that Leela has, is the strongest approach available today. It will probably require another watershed moment in artificial intelligence to build a stronger type of chess engine. Without further ado, let's look at one of my favorite victories from Stockfish in this event, an amazing Sicilian game. As I've already indicated here, the opening is a Sicilian. We get e4 and c5. Now, the opening moves are dictated by the TCEC. So we're going to zip through here to move 6. That's when we get the interesting move 6g4 in this position. This is the 5th most popular move in this position. To a human, this would look much more natural if the knight were already on f6. Then this would basically be like a carries attack, one of the strongest openings available to white in the Sicilian, depending on how black plays. But in this case, the move looks a little bit premature to a human at least, but it turns out to be very strong. It's important in looking at these opening moves to understand the TCEC. The TCEC picks the opening moves to ensure interest and diversity in the positions, and then both engines have to play the position once with white and with black. So in this case, Stockfish has white, but in the game before this, it had black and had drawn a long and difficult game. So here, after the move g4, both engines continued in the same way. We get h6, h4, pawn to a6, and now a move that I would not have considered, knight takes c6. Now, possibly partially due to the influence of engines, we're seeing more of this kind of move in Sicilians, but at least instinctively to me and my classical chess education, it seems very odd to trade an active knight for a more passive one and to reinforce the center for your opponent when you do it, and then to allow them a half-open b file that also looks pretty useful as well. However, it turns out that this is really kind of good for white because the pieces jump to active squares, and black's pieces are struggling in some ways, and particularly it becomes difficult to develop the king side over here for reasons that we'll break down in a moment. In any case, after the recapture here on c6, the move queen d3 is played by Stockfish. Now, in its game against Leela when it had the black pieces, Leela had continued with queen f3, and then there was the move d5. So this game is going to develop on entirely different lines. After the move queen d3, I think a very human move would be rook to b8, but then good is b3. And you have the idea of bishop a3 and castles queenside in some lines. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never seen a Sicilian where you play bishop a3, but the idea of that or fianchettoing the bishop turns out to be really, really strong and effective in this particular opening. It's not like it's winning, but it's certainly a worthwhile idea for white. In any case, in this game, the move knight to f6 is played, and of course, that invites the advance of the g-pawn. So we do get g5, pawn takes g5, and bishop takes g5. Now, this structure over here isn't one that I see too often in a Sicilian. The position here with you kind of having opened up the half-open h-file for this rook over here, you having a pin here, but it turns out to be very strong, and we'll see some of the tactics that Stockfish gets as a result. So, after the recapture with bishop takes g5, we see queen b6 attacking b2 and castles. Now, you would have to be a very greedy player, I think greedier than Yasser Seirawan, to consider queen takes f2 in this position. You're underdeveloped and you should not be capturing pawns like this. Of course, there is a punishment and it is swift. It is the move pawn to e5. You can't capture because there is mate. And although you can avoid mate with, for example, knight d5, there is now knight to e4, attacking the queen, winning a pawn back on d6, and obviously maintaining a huge, huge lead in development. So after castles, we instead see the move pawn to a5 over here on the queen side. Now queen to f3, bishop to d7, bishop to c4, rook b8. Of course, we're not going to drop b2. The computer will never drop b2. Bishop to b3. And now in this position, I think it's important to note that bishop e7 kind of seems like the most natural move here, but it turns out that after h5, the idea of h6 undermining the knight on f6 is really strong, and it's hard to hold this position for black. Well, impossible to hold this position for black. As a result, it's basically impossible to develop the king side, and that's a big part of Stockfish 12's advantage in this position. So the move c5 is played. Black is banking fully on counterplay on the queen side. There's possibly the idea of pawn to a4, and a more serious threat seems to be the move pawn to c4, when you don't want to capture because you'll drop b2, so you might win the bishop here on b3. But it turns out that there is a way for Stockfish to allow this. Pawn to h5. The threats on the king side are more serious than the loss of the bishop on b3. If you play pawn to c4 here, very deep analysis shows that h6 is winning for white. It turns out that you can give up the bishop on b3, and after the recapture, your king is totally safe. And the threats over here on the king side are going to net you a piece back, at least, or a winning attack. Now, the idea of just capturing here on g7 and then capturing on f6 is, of course, immediate and very dangerous, so the knight kind of needs to move from f6. But if you try knight h7, there is then bishop to e3, pulling back the attacked bishop and attacking the queen in turn, queen to b7, h takes g7, bishop takes g7, and now queen g3. It certainly doesn't seem like white should have so much, but in this position, after this bishop is either exchanged or removed from this diagonal in some other way by being chased off, there's going to be too much pressure on the h-file, and the queen can come into g7. It turns out that this will win material back thanks to the tactical problems due to this pin, and that's going to be enough for a winning advantage. For example, bishop f6 and the excellent move bishop to d4, trying to exchange off that bishop. If you try to keep it with e5, there's knight d5, and white's advantage is decisive. You can also consider knight to g8, but then again, pawn takes g7, bishop takes g7, and you're going to invade on the h-file after rook h1 and, for example, bishop e5, rook h7, this pawn is too soft, and again, white's advantage is decisive. Very, very nice, very deep stuff. So after pawn to h5, what we actually see is a4. Now it's possible to play knight takes a4 because if the bishop captures, you can capture back with check, so there's no time to capture here on b2. And after knight takes a4, we get queen to a5, trying to get some counterplay over here on the queen side. So queen to a5, bishop takes f6, and pawn takes f6. The knight falls back to c3, queen back to b6, queen to d3, stopping c4 here, king up to e7, a3, bishop h6 check, king to b1, and rook hc8, threatening again pawn to c4 with devastation. Now queen c4. This move obviously stops c4, but it looks very, very superficial. In fact, if you showed me this position without having seen the game and the computer analysis, I would probably think that black is not doing so badly here. After all, this bishop is unopposed on the dark squares. It looks like the king is safe behind this wall of pawns. And how are you going to kind of advance the h-pawn, which should kind of be your trump in this position? But deep analysis shows that white does have dangerous threats here. There are ideas like pawn to e5 and other ways of breaking through, and black can really do nothing in the position. So rook c6 is played. Now rook over to e1. It certainly looks like the buildup is very dangerous here, but how do you break through? Rook c7, rook to d3, and the losing move is the next move. But it may already be impossible to save the position. At least it's very difficult for black. For example, a natural move like rook c to c8 here allows e5 with a very, very strong, maybe decisive attack. Capturing with this pawn opens up the possibility of invasion on this diagonal, which is dangerous, and capturing with the d pawn instead opens the d file, which is also very dangerous. The king is not feeling safe on e7, and this idea of pawn to e5 is a problem. And there are other ideas that also increase the pressure, and black is tied down without counterplay. So in the game, the move bishop f4 is played. And I think, having seen the way the game develops, that we can say definitively that this is the losing move. But it takes one of the deepest combinations that I've ever seen to show that. It is the move knight to d5 check. This is an amazing move. It looks simple, but it's very deep, and white will have to invest more material to break through. Now, of course, knight d5 is forking all the things. Everything in the black camp basically is forked, so you must capture the knight. Pawn takes, and this has opened up an attack on this bishop here on f4, and of course there is the check now on the king on e7. So the only way to keep the material is bishop e5. Now, at this point, you might be thinking, that wasn't so deep. I just play f4, pin it and win it, I get my bishop back, and come on, that's easy. Of course the computer saw that. I just can't believe it was allowed. But in this position, there is bishop b5 with a counter skewer, and it is black who wins. So what is the solution? It turns out to be the very patient move queen to h4, avoiding the skewer here and threatening rook takes e5, pawn takes, and then d6 check. For example, if c4 with a fork here, then rook takes e5 is more important. White's threats get there first. Pawn takes, d6 check, and white is winning. But there are alternatives, right? So after queen h4, what if you move the king? Well, basically White's ideas still include rook takes e5 or pawn to f4. So if you try, for example, king f8, then f4 is just too strong. If you try bishop d4 here, you could actually go for rook takes, pawn takes, you're down a rook, but with queen takes here, intending something like pawn to h6 and multiple other moves, then you're just winning the game. The massive pieces over here on the queen side is irrelevant. Certainly the king is what matters in this case. So it makes sense that king d8 was played in the game. The king is trying to run over to this side of the board where it hopes to be safe. But now there's another amazing move. Rook takes e5 anyway. After rook takes e5, white is going to be down a full rook, without a good hope of recouping most of the material right away. Pawn takes e5, and you might be expecting d6, but this is actually a mistake that encourages the rook to go to a better square. Stronger, as played in the game, is rook to f3, intending rook to f6. And of course, the h-pawn is also a problem, as indicated after king c8 and then h6 in this position, and this is the game. Now, this is a good moment to pause and assess a little bit. White is down a rook, and as the king is running over here, there is certainly no hope of checkmating this king anymore. White only has 2 pawns for the rook. How can this be good? Well, it turns out that white only has 2 pawns for the rook now, but a lot of black's pawns are falling very, very quickly. So white will soon have not just 2, but 3, and then 4, and then 5 pawns for the rook, and there's not a lot black can do about it. Also, black's pieces are not really able to do anything effective in terms of counterplay, and the h-pawn is pretty strong. Now, black can kind of deal with the h-pawn, but doing so will tie down pieces. So all of this mounts up to a winning position for white. If you, for example, play c4 here, which is the only attempt for counterplay here, there is h7 threatening to promote with check, king to b7, and promoting here is too early because of the simple capture and then the capture of this bishop. Although I don't think you can capture the bishop right away. But the strongest move here is just bishop takes c4, threatening rook to b3, threatening promotion, and because the king is on b7, there is no mate on b2. So after pawn to h6, and then king to b7, we now see bishop c4, bishop a4, rook takes f6, 3 pawns for the rook, queen a5, the excellent queen e4, which threatens this and controls e1, no check from the queen, and bishop b5, d6 check, bishop c6, queen takes e5, 4 pawns for the rook, rook over to e8, queen f5, rook d7, rook takes f7, and 5 pawns for the rook. So we're back to material equality and clearly winning here. Queen d8, rook g7, king b6, b4. As a human, you probably would not want to open up your own king in this position. You would want to play more conservatively. But the engine, of course, is calculating deeply. It's not concerned about illusory threats to the king. It can see if there's actually any substance to those threats. Pawn takes, rook takes g7, queen to c5 check, king b7, pawn takes g7, rook e1 check, king up to b2, queen f6. And it looks like white has gone wrong. The g7 pawn, presumably the best pawn on the board, is falling. However, again, these are computer engines. They calculate so deeply. It is one of the strengths of Stockfish NNUE is that it also calculates deeply in addition to having deep positional evaluations. So it's calculated that after pawn c3, the loss of the g7 pawn is okay because b5 is coming. There's no good place for the bishop to move. It goes to e4, and it's very impressive here that exchanging this bishop off is still enough to win. Bishop d5 check. I think an exclamation point move. Bishop takes, queen takes d5 check. And here, after king a7, the engine surrendered. First off, if you go king c8, which seems natural because you want to stay close to the possibly promoting pawn, there's of course check, and then you have a skewer or this square, and you pick up the queen here on g7. But why did black resign after king a7? Well, it turns out that d7 is just over, right? And you're going to make a queen, and okay, there's like a check, but it doesn't lead anywhere. This is just winning for white. But a human could definitely still mess this up. A very human mistake here would be the move b6 check after the king has gone to a7 in the final position. Now, why would you include b6 check? The point would be that after the king captures or falls back, when you push d7, your next move will be promoting with check. That seems useful. That seems like a good, clean calculation that makes things a little bit easier for you, kind of giving you an extra tempo. The b pawn doesn't matter if you're making a new queen. Why not give it up to make sure that you promote with check? Well, the problem with this b6 check move is that it's too clever for its own good. You have king b8 by black here, not capturing the pawn, and it turns out that the position is a draw because of d7. And now rook b1 check, exclamation point, king takes b1, queen g1, or queen gives any other check, and then the queen is going to sacrifice herself. There's no way out of the checks unless you ultimately capture the queen at some point, and when you do, it is stalemate with the king on b8. But of course, a computer's not falling for that. In the past, it might have happened, but not today. And after king a7, resignation is of course justified. I hope that you've enjoyed this game. Congratulations to Stockfish 12 on winning the TCEC. Congratulations to its developers on their great achievements in computer chess. If you want to see more incredible games from Stockfish or from Leela, then click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen right as I finish here.